We often stop and listen to a shed full of chickens to understand if something's wrong. So when they're week old and we hear lots and lots of distress vocalizations and it's really loud, are they too cold? Is there something bothering them? If it's silent, what's frightening them? So we use these vocalizations. But have you ever thought about how the chickens themselves are interpreting the vocalizations of their flock buddies and how that could impact their behaviour? We did wonder this, and let me show you what we found. So domestic fowl have about 20 different vocalizations that we know about. And vocalizations are really important for chicks. They know who their mother is within 1 to 3 days after they hatch by vocalizations alone. And that maternal care is really important. We know that chicks can survive without mum, but when mum is present, they learn fundamental behaviours from their mother. And that this often results in more synchronised behaviour and changes to their behavioural time budgets, like more time spent eating. But of course, we can't provide mums to chicks in industry because it's just not practical. We could think by security reasons alone. So what we can do is we can provide them with artificial components of that maternal care. And this isn't a new idea. There has been some research into olfaction, so providing mother hen smells to the chicks, visual cues like light dark cycles that mimic what they would experience when they're going out and exploring and then going underneath mum to a warm dark environment. And possibly I think what's the easiest way is using auditory components of the maternal care. And that's what we were looking at. So maternal hen vocalizations. And this is what we've been doing for the past 3 years. And let me tell you what we found. Highs and lows. So we found some practical information. So maybe not the most exciting scientific discovery, but we found that calls can be played over background noise levels in commercial sheds without being aversive to chicks. So a really important practical question to say, is this even viable to use on farm? We also answered and now know that the location of the speaker doesn't change the efficacy of maternal calls. Again, maybe not going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but a really important question, because if we needed to put a speaker that's emitting feed calls on every single feeder in the shed, that's hundreds of speakers and really expensive exercise compared to putting some speakers up on the roof. But we could only do that if we saw that location wasn't impacting the efficacy, and it wasn't. We got to learn a little bit more about this elusive roost call. There is not a lot about this roost call in the literature, and we didn't even have a recording of it. So it was quite exciting. We got 7 mothers and their clutches together and just spied on them. And what we saw was she emits the roost call less frequently than feed and cluck calls, but it's consistent as chicks age, and it occurs more frequently than just at roosting time. So there seems to be another function of this vocalization. I'm very sad to report that maternal calls didn't attract free-range chickens back into the shed from the outdoor range. So the idea behind this is there are often times when producers need to get birds back into the shed. So if we think about the middle of summer in South Australia, the temperature is rising. The birds out on the range are probably having a cool breeze and quite fine, but the birds inside the shed, where it's become really difficult to regulate that temperature and control because the pop holes are open, they're at risk of heat stress. So those birds need to be brought back into the shed. And I have done a lot of work on commercial farms and have watched a lot of producers spend a lot of time doing this, and with some very creative methods to do this. So I've seen producers bring their whole families and children out to push birds back into the range while the doors are into the shed while the doors are closing, noisy sticks and quad bikes. It is extremely time consuming. And from the bird's perspective, we're ultimately giving them a bit of a fright to push them back in the shed. So we thought, well, wouldn't that be great if you could use a mother hen cluck call, which is basically come here, to attract them back into the shed. But it didn't work. But they were listening. So we found evidence that maternal calls can actually have stress ameliorating effects. So I'm going to focus on that last one today. But what I should tell you that in a variety of contexts, maternal calls didn't initiate an immediate behavioural response. So this is a feed call, and we put it behind the feeder, thinking chicks would hear it and go immediately to the feeder, but they didn't. There's that elusive roost call, sounds a bit like a cat, and this was under a nice, dark, warm brooder. We'd think it would be an immediate behavioural response. It wasn't. And here's our top call, trying to tell these chickens to come back into the shed. And as you can see, they just didn't listen. Probably like all progeny when they hear mothers come here calls. But they were listening. And the way we were able to look at this was we were playing maternal calls to a group of birds, white noise to another group of birds, and then we took a range of assessments on behaviour and welfare. One of the first ones we looked at was a chick anxiety depression model. And so what we do, it's a little bit nasty, but we isolate chicks, you can see them here, at 5 days of age, and they're on their own and they're in a novel environment. And we listen to their distress calls. You can see that here. You can hear that. And then also we can see this on the spectrogram here. And we count the number of distress calls. We leave them in there for 1 hour. And this test has been validated previously, and it's been validated pharmacologically, which means we use drugs to then monitor their behavioural responses. And so what we see is the researchers here left them in this arena for 120 minutes. This yellow line here is the number of distress vocalisations when a chick is put in with a conspecific, with a buddy. When they are isolated, we see this huge spike in the number of distress vocalisations, and we see quite a rapid decline in the number of those vocalisations over time. These researchers then gave the birds an anxiolytic, so something that reduces anxiety, and what we see is the number of vocalisations decrease. And when the birds are given an antidepressant, we can see that the gradient, the number is still there, but the gradient or the slope in the decline is much less. So it's almost as if they're anxious, they're going to be emitting a lot of vocalisations, but then they sort of think, what's the point in a depressive-like state, and emit fewer over time. So what we found was actually quite extraordinary, the difference. These are the number of distress vocalisations, and we see that our control birds were emitting a lot of distress vocalisations compared to those maternal call birds that received the maternal call. We also see this reduction over time, potentially suggesting that our control birds were more of an anxious and depressed-like state relative to our maternal call birds. We also looked at physiological stress indicators, and this is a relatively new one. We looked at eye and ear temperatures of the birds, and the idea being that eye temperatures decrease with stress and ear temperatures would increase with stress. So when we look at our left eye and the right eye and the ear before and after this 1 hour isolation test, we see that it's the left eye that is associated with the number of distress vocalizations. So that seems to be a good indicator for us. And when we look at the left eye temperature between our treatment groups, we see a lower temperature in the control group than the maternal call, suggesting a greater fear response or stress response. We don't see that in the right eye temperature. We then looked at the neurophysiology and we looked at their brains. And so this was an exciting part of the project, actually led me down to study a Masters of Neuroscience, so I can understand more about the chicken brain. And here's one that we've dissected here. And in particular, we were interested in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus, all about learning and memory, and also the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus was important for quite a few reasons. It's sort of your homeostasis part of the brain, but importantly, it regulates mesotocin, which is the oxytocin or that social hormone for chickens, and also the physiological stress response. So these are the things we looked at. And I really need to shout out to Associate Professor Adam Hamlin, who was the neuroscientist on this project and taught me how to dissect and lots of other things about brains, and Sarbas Qasim, who did all of the gene expression in the brain. And so what we found, surprisingly, no differences with mesotocin, but we did see differences in receptors associated with the physiological stress response in birds that were given maternal calls. And interestingly, we have receptor 1 and receptor 2. Receptor 2 is all about cardiac function, but receptor 1 is specific to that physiological stress response. So nicely, we're starting to see these changes in brain and behaviour. We also had a look at what they were doing in their home pens. So the idea being that more socially cohesive animals will cluster together. And so we had a look at where they were actually spending their time in relation to their group. And we found that more observations in the maternal call pens were likely to see 80 to 100% of the group together compared to our control birds. Now, of course, we don't know. Maybe they're cold, maybe they're frightened, but we have measures of temperature and those sorts of things, and it does tend to suggest that this is a pro-social response we're seeing. We also wanted to look at curiosity. And we can do this in a variety of ways. And one we did in their home pen. So we give them this novel object. It's a pretty traditional novel object that's used in the literature. And we just place it within their pen. And we watch them from the video cameras above to see how long it actually takes them to interact. So are they curious or are they frightened of this new stimulus in their environment? So we found, in terms of the number of pens, there were more pens that physically interacted with the novel object in the maternal call group. They approached the novel object quicker. They were more likely to visually inspect. So yes, pecking on it is one thing, but actually going over and visually inspecting. More of the birds from the maternal call treatments did that. They were quicker to do so. And after 10 to 20 minutes, a higher proportion of birds from the maternal groups were closer to that novel object compared to the control. So altogether, this is suggesting that they are more curious, or potentially less fearful. When we isolate them, when they're older, when they're 42 days, we don't see a difference between our treatment groups in approaching the novel object. We also looked at, are they willing to approach a human? And we saw no difference either. We took that classic indicator of fearfulness, tonic immobility with these chickens, where you put the birds on the back and you basically mimic a predator by putting slight pressure on them, and you see how long they'll stay in that state. and we saw no difference. Again, we looked at eye temperatures in relation to some of these tests. And again, it was the left eye that was coming out and telling us that that was important in terms of being related to freezing behaviour, which we know is an indicator of fear with chickens. We did see differences in wattle temperature. It was higher and higher, meaning a greater physiological stress response for birds in the control group compared to the maternal call. This is a lot of information. I'm nearly there and I'm going to wrap it up for you. What is important that at no stage were we able to show that feed calls had an impact on feed consumption, feed conversion, or body weight in either sex. So what we found is that maternal calls, when played to chicks from day one, altered stress responses and social behaviour early in life. It didn't seem to have long-term impacts on fearfulness, particularly when those birds were isolated. But we did see evidence of long-term impacts on physiological stress responses and temperament, such as increased curiosity and a reduction of physiological stress responses as a result of capture and handling. So, great, we can measure a lot of things. Where to now? What does that actually mean? Well, I think we now need to understand, is this buffering of that stress response applicable to commercial conditions? So we know that there are inevitable stresses in a meat chicken's life. So that could be catching and transportation for slaughter. It could be hatching, vaccination, handling, transportation on day one of life. It could be turning the litter. And now we want to ask, can playing these maternal vocalizations actually reduce stress responses to these stressful situations? I'm not the first, of course, to think about this. There's a really great group in France who looked at providing a mother odorant, so an artificial stimulation of the maternal gland smell, and gave that to chicks. And yes, it reduced stress. They found that by measuring heterophil lymphocyte and corticosterone. And this is the reduction in stress for males and females. But also what I think is important here is to show that when they were processing the birds, they also looked at the percentage of birds suffocated and scratched, and quite extraordinary results. So reduction 22% of birds scratched down to 8%. And when we look at the number of females suffocated, it was half when they had that maternal odorant. So maybe it's less practical. We know that we can put a speaker up, and maybe maternal vocalizations can have similar impacts on chicken welfare and also downgrades and economics. Also, we did look at the feed call, but if we look at how she talks to her chicks over time, feed calls are really important in that first week of life, and then they reduce. They probably know how to eat by then. Maybe we need to be looking at these cluck calls, which seem more consistent over time, or these roost calls that are less frequent but consistent over time. So again, I'd just really like to stop and acknowledge the incredible work. I took on this project thinking, we'll just stick up a speaker and it'll be easy, and it was not. So Jean-Louis Rolt from the University of Vienna, Manisha Kolak-Shai-Party, the wonderful Professor Paul McDonald, who is an avian communication specialist at UNE, and of course Joanne Edgar from University of Bristol, who really was the brain behind this project or developing the hypotheses. AgriFutures for funding the project. We also had Hayley Herriot, who was all about ruminants until I brought her into the dark side of chickens. Sarbas and Ashley England from University of New England, who did all of our gene expression work. Adam Hamlin, incredible neuroscientist. Hugh Nolan and Lara Fanning, who listened to a lot of secret conversations between mothers and chicks. The wonderful staff at CART, Des Schneider, who is a tech guru. And I don't have a picture of Bradley Dawson, but he's from the Science and Engineering Workshop at the University of New England. And I don't think any project there could move forward without him. And he made us a beautiful program to be able to utilise and present these calls to the chickens. So here are my details. These 2 talks have got 70, 80-page reports and multiple publications, so simply not enough time to go through everything today, but please do feel free to reach out at any time. And of course, the final project reports are up on the AgriFutures website. And Rochelle, thanks so much for the opportunity to share today.